Is drinking raw milk safe like RFK Jr. suggests? Can you reduce a glucose spike if you eat your food in, quote-unquote, the right order? I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp. I host a nutrition myth-busting podcast called Bite Back with Abby Sharp. And those are just some of the questions I tackle with qualified experts on my show. There is so much food misinformation and disinformation out there, and it can feel impossible to know what's real and what's BS. On Bite Back, my goal is to help listeners create a pleasurable relationship with food, their body, and themselves, which in my opinion is the fundamental secret to good health. Listen to Bite Back wherever you get your podcasts.
Stop by Sherwin-Williams and get 30% off select paints and stains June 13th through the 23rd. It's the perfect time to transform your space with color. Refresh your home inside and out with colors that make every space feel brand new. From cozy interiors to stunning exteriors, we've got the perfect shade for your next project. Shop the sale online or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store. Click the banner to learn more. Retail sales only. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Canada is hosting the G7 summit in the Rocky Mountain village of Kananaskis, Alberta, just an hour west of Calgary. It's Prime Minister Mark Carney's first major test on the global stage. 2 days of high-stakes talks with leaders from the US, UK, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the European Union, plus some invited guests who will attend on the sidelines. Carney opened the summit on Monday morning with a one-on-one meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump, his first visit to Canada since walking out of the 2018 G7 in Quebec. The stakes couldn't be higher. I'm Mark Day, and today on The Big Story, Cormac Mac Sweeney, Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for news radio stations across the country and a regular contributor to The Big Story, is in Kananaskis covering the G7 summit. Cormac, day one started with a one-on-one meeting between the Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump. In a news conference following that meeting, we didn't hear much about progress on a new trade deal, but both sides worked through the day, and by the end of the afternoon, Prime Minister Mark Carney's office said that U.S. President Donald Trump has agreed to reach a deal on a new economic and security relationship with Canada by mid-July.
Yeah, it was a late-day surprise, I guess. So this bilateral meeting happened, and everything seemed to go pretty well. The president seemed to be chatting with Mark Carney with a smile on his face. He had a pin on his lapel that had the Canada and U.S. flag, which drew some attention. And he talked about wanting to get something done with Canada. That trade was his priority at this G7 summit, and that he wanted to try and see if he could work something out, get to the bottom of it. Those are the words that he was using, and everything seemed to be going well. Afterwards, we had a scrum with Dominic LeBlanc, the Canada-U.S. trade minister, as well as Kristen Hillman, the Canadian ambassador to the U.S., and both of them said that they were agreeing to accelerate talks. That later this week, they were going to have more meetings with U.S. officials to try and get this in the works, but noting that a deal wasn't done yet. But it wasn't until we got what's called the readout. So whenever there are meetings between the Prime Minister and another world leader, usually the Prime Minister's office issues a readout, sort of recapping what the two leaders discussed. It wasn't until we got that document that we saw a specific timeline. So now we know how long we're expecting it to take before we get a new economic and security deal between Canada and the U.S. The Prime Minister's office says the two leaders agreed to try and reach that deal within the next 30 days. So 1 month and counting until we see the details of that negotiation that's been underway for some time now between Mark Carney and Donald Trump, and how that's going to impact businesses across the country. I do know that a lot of business groups that I've been speaking with for many months now have said, obviously the tariffs are awful, but they want stability. And that's something that most in the business world need so that they can plan appropriately. A lot of projects in Canada have been scuttled due to this trade war, not so much of because of the tariffs, but because of some of the uncertainty about whether these projects could move ahead in the future. They've been put on pause. So now we have a 30-day timeline before we see what comes of these negotiations.
And during that news conference with Prime Minister Carney and the U.S. President Donald Trump, he also complained about throwing Russia out of what was once the G8.
He seemed to be blaming Russia's removal from the G8 on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and then President Barack Obama, although the funny thing is that they were first removed from the G8 and not invited because of the annexation in Crimea, which was back in 2014, and that was when Stephen Harper was the prime minister. Of course, the issue with Justin Trudeau was that when they did the G7 in Charlevoix, Trump wanted to bring Putin back, and Trudeau said no. So that may be what Trump was trying to refer to, but it came off as blaming the initial kicking of Russia out of the G8 on Trudeau. So, those sorts of fact-checking you have to do all the time when you're watching Donald Trump. And yeah, as you say, it's very unpredictable with Trump. We thought it was just going to be a photo op, and it ended up being about an 8-minute question and answer session in the middle of a bilateral meeting that took over an hour, by the way. But, I think the question about Putin was also kind of put to bed there, as much as Trump said that he thought it was a mistake and he thought Putin was insulted, and he questioned why they would be talking about somebody yet not invite them to the table to have a say in that. Of course, coming up today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is going to be speaking with G7 leaders, and that may be what Trump was referring to. But when it came to the question of whether he is now still asking for Putin to rejoin, he kind of said, that's sort of past. That's the impression that he gave. And Mark Carney immediately nodding along with that when he said that. But it was interesting that he brought it up almost unprompted to talk about that because, we know that this is something that he has said in the past, and it might have thrown Mark Carney off a little bit in that little Q&A.
Well, from Russia to the Middle East, global security is front and center at the summit. And now the issue with Iran and Israel has surged to the top of the G7 agenda, topic where reaching consensus could prove especially difficult. We're now into day 5 of those missiles being directed back and forth between those two countries.
Yeah, and Trump did talk about it, saying that he's heard from Iran and they want to cut a deal. And he says that deal should have happened before. He said they were looking for a deal. It never came. And then all of this happened. He thinks Iran is going to lose this military conflict. However, it's not clear whether we will see any real plan of action from the G7 coming out of this summit on this issue. Of course, all leaders were discussing the Israel-Iran conflict at a working dinner on global security that was held before a cultural event. And obviously, we're not privy to all the conversations that are going to be happening there, but nonetheless, there's a low expectation that we're going to see any grand statement. If there is something that does come out, I think a lot of experts are expecting the G7 to possibly call for some sort of de-escalation, something vague. But most of the security experts I've been speaking with in the lead up to the G7 and through it is that the only country that really has a lot of sway with that region is the United States. And what Donald Trump says will matter on that. So it may be a matter of the other G7 leaders just trying to convince Trump on something. So we'll wait and see whether that actually leads to anything. But I think there's little expectation that we'll get any grand statements of action coming out of this or any major commitments from G7 leaders.
Well, the U.S. president, the United States, they make a lot of headlines when they're at the G7 summit. But there are 6 other countries that are meeting as well, and also some guests who were invited by Prime Minister Mark Carney to attend on the sidelines.
Oh, yeah. Basically, in between sessions of the G7 working on things, you have different bilateral meetings between the leaders. Of course, the host usually speaks with all the G7 leaders as well as a lot of the invited guests holding these bilateral meetings. And, the economy is top of mind for Canada as well as most of the other countries who are here. It's one of the main, grander themes of discussion. They're discussing things like energy security, critical minerals, emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. So these are the sorts of things they've been discussing. In advance of the G7, the Prime Minister met with the UK's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and had him on a state visit to Ottawa before they both took off for Alberta. And there they were discussing those very issues about more trade and defense pacts. And that's something as well that Canada will be discussing with the European Union. One of the other invited guests, Mark Carney, has made it clear he wants to join that Rearm Europe defense pact. And that would allow Canada to have more options when it comes to military procurement and other military initiatives. And it's a part of the grander theme for Canada to try and lessen our reliance on the United States. Geographically, of course, we can't ignore the fact that we are so dependent on the United States, but that is the dependence that we're trying to wean ourselves off of right now, and it's something the government has a clear focus on. And so this G7 summit is really important as a part of that goal as we look to not just Europe, but also Asian countries to try and find new markets for things like our agriculture products, our energy products. It's a big conversation happening right now, not just within Canada, but within other countries as they look for other trade partners who might bring more stability than the U.S. Canada's trying, at least, to step up and be that partner. So we'll see how these talks work out. I will note for a lot of listeners that a lot of talks that do happen here at the G7 and other global summits like this don't necessarily end in results immediately. It's not like you have the talk and immediately you have an announcement to go. Sometimes that is the case, but not always. But these conversations between leaders likely lead to further conversations between officials down the line, and eventually you see some sort of deal that is had as a result of that. So that's why these sorts of summits are so vital for not just Canada, but any world leader that wants to attend, especially those who are the invited guests who don't normally get to have that kind of FaceTime with G7 leaders who are the larger economies.
Did your last vacation house for the whole crew leave you wishing there was a better way to stay together? Like with bedrooms that are all great, so everyone thinks they got the best room?
Whoa! This is amazing.
A full bathroom in every bedroom?
Hey, mine's got a bathroom.
A beach around an epic, clear bay big enough for swimming, rope swinging, and even kayaking? All next door to Walt Disney World? Next trip, share a house at Evermore Orlando Resort. You won't believe what you resorted to before.
Well, things didn't end well in 2018 at the G7 summit in Quebec. You were there. You were covering it. Donald Trump had left early. He was on his way for a meeting in North Korea at the time. And while he was in Air Force One, he made a tweet in reference to the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Things didn't end well on that go-around. This time it seems like things are a little bit smoother, and that relationship between the Prime Minister of Canada and the U.S. President.
Yeah, I think a lot of experts, including a former advisor to the Prime Minister, had said the only success that they see out of this is if it doesn't implode, as we saw with Charlevoix. So if they can just survive and just get through it, then this should be considered a success. Now, governments always like to lower expectations so that if they don't achieve what they have in their head, that it's still considered a success. And if they go above and beyond that, well, then it's an even better win. That's the way a lot of parties and politicians like to do it. So we'll see what comes out of this. But the issue is there might not be a consensus on a lot of different issues. So the Israel-Iran issue, for one, that we mentioned earlier. Ukraine and Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky is looking for more military and financial aid from the G7 leaders in his pitch later. And so whether we see that or not, I think, even the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress is telling me that they don't expect to have a consensus on that. They see it as some of the countries will agree and they'll have their own sort of side statement. So I'm not expecting a full final communique like we normally get at these G7 meetings. The indications have been that we might actually do something different, that the host, Prime Minister Carney, will just sort of release a statement, maybe a recap of what they discussed, and maybe a few different things that they might have agreed on, but not the full sort of wide-ranging communique that we have traditionally been used to, where all leaders agree to everything. This is not going to be one of those G7 summits. And so we'll have to wait and see how that sort of played with it at the end.
With any G7 summit, you will find protests in Calgary as well as in Banff. A pro-Khalistan rally by 6 in Calgary attracted over about 100 people, marking the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister Modi. Protesters waving blue, yellow Khalistan flags held posters of Modi in an effort to put pressure on him. And Mark Carney had pressure from even within his own Liberal caucus on that invite that he extended to the Prime Minister from India.
Yeah, I think it was bound to be controversial to invite India's Prime Minister, given everything that's happened. I mean, in 2023, Prime Minister Trudeau at the time had come forward with his public accusations that the Indian government was tied to the killing of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in BC on Canadian soil. And then we later heard of more allegations from the RCMP of violent acts that occurred that allegedly were tied to the Indian government. India denies this, but that invitation has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. A lot of people have raised the question of how Canada could stand up for human rights around the world and yet not stand up to India for the actions that they had here. Now, the other side of this is that the government says, look, India is one of the largest economies in the world. We are having conversations about global economic initiatives here amid a very uncertain time. And you can't cut out one of the largest economies in the world. We need India at the table. And the Prime Minister did say that he extended the invitation after there were more law enforcement agreements to share information and to work a little bit closer together. So politically, I think it's going to potentially cause some issues for the Prime Minister. We've already seen the backlash that has happened, especially from the Sikh community, who doesn't believe that Modi should be on our soil right now. Others have expressed similar concerns. However, there are a lot of experts as well who say, look, as much as we have that bilateral problem, the fact of the matter is the G7 is a global summit, and given India's place in the world, it was right to extend this invitation despite these other issues.
Well, I'm sure right now you're standing in front of that beautiful backdrop of the mountains in Kananaskis in the Banff area. Stunning to look at and quite the venue to hold the G7 summit. This is the second time that it's been held in that beautiful area of the country.
I mean, it's frankly stunning. Anybody who has been here would stand in awe of the mountain ranges that you see all around you, especially in Banff and in Kananaskis. So the drive out or the flight out for those leaders who took military helicopters out, and I believe one or two might have taking those helicopter rides, but nonetheless, it is a gorgeous part of the country and a brilliant one to bring people to, because if you wanted to impress world leaders, if you wanted to get them onto your side as you're trying to negotiate some sort of economic deal, let's say, taking them to a very picturesque place that would make them in awe is probably a smart move.
I appreciate your time and your insight into the G7 summit in Kananaskis. That's Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing at hello@bigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. And you can find us on the Seeker app or on all of your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share.